This is HR in Review, a podcast dedicated to HR thought leadership, actionable advice, and all the latest developments in human resource management.
Welcome to another episode of the HR in Review show. I'm your guest host today, Bill Banham, and joining me on this episode is Richard Lucas, CEO and co-founder over at Govox, an online mental health wellbeing platform. With 30 years of senior leadership experience, Richard has a unique take on mental health and well-being. A personal story led him and a like-minded team to create Govox. Having witnessed firsthand how technology and social media have fueled mental health issues, Richard is now committed to using technology positively to enable change and readdress the balance with a much more supportive approach. Richard will also be a speaker at the upcoming DisruptHR Cambridge event happening May 11th. Hey Richard, welcome to the show today.
Hi Bill, thanks for having us on.
HR in Review is a podcast dedicated to HR thought leadership, actionable advice, and all the latest developments in human resource management. You can subscribe at hrreview.co.uk/podcast or find us on your podcast app.
So, Richard, beyond my wee introduction there, why don't you take a minute or two and introduce yourself a bit more to the audience and tell them a bit about why you created Govox?
Yeah, absolutely, and thank you very much for the opportunity. So, I'm Richard Lucas. I'm the one of the co-founders of Govox Wellbeing. Quite interestingly, and I think for this audience, I've had no previous experience in HR and no previous experience in wellbeing. But as was mentioned in your introduction, we were kind of founded through a kind of personal moment, a point in our lives where something happened that impacted us. And for us, that was to do with my passion outside of work. So outside of work, rugby is my sport of choice. I've played it for the majority of my life. Too old and too broken to play it these days. But I'll keep the story short. Back in 2018, when I believe we were in what I call the statistical stage of mental health and well-being, as in we were all as leaders and managers and kind of support people aware of there was a challenge coming, but we didn't quite really understand it, but lots of percentages of that and numbers of this. But it's only when we got faced with it ourselves, and sadly in our local rugby community, we lost two young guys to suicide. And it made us stop and think about our role in that as leaders, as people that were there to support. And then that small, well, pretty significant event led us to ask a lot of questions, led us to kind of reach out and start talking to people about kind of what could be done differently. And that was the start of Govox. The gap that we identified is really quite simple. Even back in 2018, so pre-pandemic, I know that would be a dateline in history. So pre-pandemic, there was a lot of support available for people. Organisations were starting to think quite seriously. We started to hear about things like mental health first aiders and wellbeing apps and all of these wonderful things. But people weren't accessing the support either quick enough, soon enough, or in some sad cases at all. And that was the reason why we kind of created Govox.
This edition of HR in Review is a special guest episode brought to you in partnership with our friends at the North American-based HR Chat podcast, a podcast focused on interviews with HR, talent, and tech experts.
Okay, you started Govox to connect, identify and support those in need, Richard. And your team works with businesses plus sports teams and schools as well, I believe, to improve mental health. On the business side, we are a corporate-focused pod, of course. On the business side, how can business leaders and HR pros get better at identifying employees who need support?
In the main, HR professionals are really good at it, and actually they've always been traditionally good at it. They are the people champions within organisations, and part of the learning curve we've had over the last sort of 5 or 6 years since our founding moment is the pivotal role that HR play within the well-being and within the mental health and the support structure for employees within organisations, because they are the people champions and they know that they understand the culture better. They understand the mission and the vision for an organisation and how people want to kind of be held within within an organisation and supported to do a great job. So going back to our founding moment, lots of support available. The big challenge is to get people to know that the support is there and what is it and how they can access it. But really importantly is to help people have the confidence and the comfort to understand when they need help, because that's the big challenge. If you wait until somebody is absent from work, or if you wait until somebody decides to leave your organisation because they don't like it or they're not very happy, or within our founding moment, if we go into the kind of the darker end of things around kind of suicide and attempted suicide, those events are too late. And it's really important to try and capture these things earlier, because you can make a bigger difference when you understand that people aren't happy within their working environment.
Why not subscribe to the premium version of HR in Review? You'll get ad-free content, early and extra episodes and more. Even better, although it's the premium edition, it's absolutely free. Sign up at hrreview.co.uk/podcast.
Richard, from what you see and what your team sees on a regular basis, maybe you can share some of those key reasons that prevent employees from seeking support.
Great question, Bill. I think for us, it's the word culture sits right across the ability for people to feel comfortable to seek support in any organisation. We've had the real pleasure in the last 5 years to expand to support companies globally. And you see different cultures even at almost caricature level, kind of within the US or within New Zealand and Australia or South Africa or China. People behave very differently. But even if you bring it back to UK businesses and organisations, at one end of the scale, we know there are some toxic organisations out there. And I'm quite lucky, actually. I don't get to talk to them because they're not really thinking that proactively about supporting their people. But when people have worked in toxic organisations, they're concerned to let people know that they're struggling because they feel that they might get overlooked for the next promotion. Or if there's a restructure, they're not quite going to make the cut because somebody knows that they've got a mental health issue or a wellbeing issue. So it's a barrier of culture within some organisations. And on the flip side, more and more we start to talk to organisations and work with organisations that have completely broken the ceiling in that cultural barrier. And having an open organisation where people know that if they've not had a great week, just let somebody know, speak up, because we are here to support. And I think within society and within everything we do, although we were founded with quite a difficult story around suicide and mental health, we actually don't talk about that very often. We talk about happiness, engagement, fulfillment, connectivity, and all of the things that make people kind of come together and be more supportive. So there's a bit of work to do in organisations to get the culture right, and we love working with organisations to help shape that. And there's a bit of work to do widely that we're not scared of the subject. We're not scared to talk to somebody who's just had a tough week, or we're not scared to talk to somebody who's got some wellbeing, mental health challenges that need support. In the same way, we wouldn't be scared to talk to one of our colleagues who's got a broken leg or has had to go into hospital for an operation. That's just the norm, right? We look after them. We make sure that we support them back to work and give them all the support they need to be back and fully functioning. So the question would be, why would it be any different for mental health?
If you have any comments on the HR in Review podcast, would like to suggest a topic or speaker, or provide other feedback, you can contact us using the email podcast@hrreview.co.uk. We look forward to hearing from you.
As we all know, the pandemic brought huge pressures on all of us, and that manifested itself in a huge increase in mental health related issues in and outside of the workplace, of course. There are positives out of the pandemic too, I would like to think, such as I believe that people are talking in a more authentic way than before the pandemic. What have you seen change in the world of workplace wellbeing over the past few years?
It's been fascinating to observe, but also be part of. So I think at the very start of the pandemic, there was a bit of a bubble of kind of organisations going out and grabbing what they thought was the right thing to do, and that was a whole range of things. We saw an explosion of wellbeing apps. we saw an explosion of wellbeing training or mental health training, etc., and all those sorts of things. And they weren't the wrong things to do. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when a wellbeing day at work was that everybody got a bottle of water and an apple, and we ticked the box and we moved on. The fact that organisations were bringing in tools to support people was quite brilliant. But very quickly, it was quite evident that organisations needed programs and they needed kind of real infrastructure underneath to make sure that those tools were understood, accessed, accessible, and actually utilised. Because a lot of the utilisation and the usage rates of those types of support mechanisms that were brought in, let's say early pandemic, are really quite low, and organisations wouldn't get a great return on investment from that type of activity. So we were reasonably lucky, almost by accident, within the Govox methodology, that we didn't go down either of those routes. We kind of went for a very proactive, still technology-driven program, but avoided kind of the app bubble, because I think back in 2018, the solution to any problem in the world was to design an app, which makes me smile, because I've got hundreds on my phone, and I probably use one to order a pizza a bit too often, one to order a taxi, and one to look at the bank account, and that's about it. So there was this explosion of services available. There was explosion of tools that could be utilised, and a lot of organisations started to onboard them. What we did see within the HR world, and I've been in awe of HR professionals, particularly with my experiences in the last 5 years, is that and I have this caricature in my head of the HR lead in an organisation kind of sitting there, massively overworked, loads of stuff to do around kind of policies, processes, hiring people, making sure that all the people metrics are being well managed. And then suddenly someone knocks on their door and says, oh, by the way, you know this new thing called mental health and wellbeing, can you look after that as well? Here's another hat to wear. And I know that's very caricature, but kind of adding more and more onto the HR person's kind of shoulders. What we then saw was organisations starting to bring in kind of quite senior roles with the word well-being in. So well-being strategists or well-being directors, and kind of almost in parallel kind of starting like a subset of HR, which was also a subset of health and safety, that meant that mental health and well-being was firmly on the agenda for organisations. But very quickly, actually, we've seen that kind of tail off, and everybody has realised that HR are the people champions. They just need the tools, and they need the backing and the support, and they need the methodology to make sure that people are supported through. So we've seen a spike of kind of like well-being tools, training and roles within organisations, but we're now starting to see those tail off, because they're not as effective as essentially they are as a standalone, because a bit like health and safety, well-being runs through the DNA. It's like a stick of rock in an organisation. Happy people do brilliant things. Unhappy people are not as beneficial to any organisation as they would be if they were in a better place. So we've certainly seen that in the last sort of 4 or 5 years, and I don't think the change will end here. I think there's more to come. HR professionals are absolutely at the front of leading healthier and happier workplaces, which is quite pleasant to see.
Follow us on Twitter at HR Review, or join us on LinkedIn and Facebook.
Okay, thank you very much. By the way, I've got an image now of you using your 3 apps, ordering that pizza, jumping in the taxi to collect it, and then afterwards going, oh man, I've spent all that money on my taxi and my pizza. Okay, now listen, you will be speaking, as I mentioned in the intro, you're going to be speaking at DisruptHR Cambridge on May 11th. It's an evening event that's happening at the PwC office. I think the nearest train station is Cambridge North. Be there or be a rectangle, listeners. And your session is called How HR Pros Have Always Been the Wellbeing Champions. Can you now take a minute or two and tell our listeners a little bit about the talk and some of the hoped for learning outcomes?
Yeah, absolutely, Bill. Really looking forward to the talk. I think we've got some pretty tight timescales and a really rapid fire kind of presentation to go through. So that's going to be a personal challenge, because I love to talk, right? And I love the Govox story, and I love talking to HR professionals about how we can support them, how they can support us, and we're kind of learning together as we go. So the talk is very much kind of relates back to my answer to the previous question, and this journey that we've seen over the last 5 or 6 years of the HR leaders, HR professionals in organizations, kind of pre-pandemic. The world changed, didn't it? And we almost have to stop and think now and kind of almost that wow kind of moment in our heads that says, crikey, did we really live like that 2 or 3 years ago? We had all our organizations that maybe traditionally worked on site or in an office or at least physically together, and you had what I call the photocopier moments where you could physically see people, and if somebody came into work and they didn't look or feel or sound or behave themselves, you could pick up on it. And HR always had that great role of making sure that we had the right people in the right roles, that we were really true to our missions and visions and values as an organization, and they always championed that. I think through my career, if there was ever anything significant happening in the organizations that I worked in, and also in my later career as a leader in, the HR team were front and center of that discussion, and also in delivering that message out to the teams. And then the wellbeing bubble hit, didn't it? And I talked about our founding moment. We started off in the statistical stage of mental health. We realized we had a problem. We sadly lost a couple of friends to suicide. We wanted to do something different. We actually realized there was lots of support available, and that was pre-pandemic. There's even more available now. And we just wanted to connect people to the support when they needed it and make sure that support is relevant and timely to them. As I mentioned on my previous answer to the question, we saw the HR people kind of almost get it added onto their task list to do, then maybe get a little bit nudged sideways because the wellbeing champion came into the business. But actually it's quickly come back round, and the HR functions, the HR leads are the trailblazers, they're the banners, they're the flag wavers of well-being, of people support, of employee experience. I've seen it written so many different times in so many different job roles, but really it comes back to HR people making sure that we've got healthy, happy and engaged workforces that deliver bottom line for the business. Because at the end of the day, I'm really proud that in Govox we support education, we support across a wide range of schools and sports clubs, even up to Olympic level. But in the workplace particularly, let's not hide away from the fact that these are businesses that are there to deliver for however they're structured. It might be their shareholders, might be their founders, it might be their investors, etc. And having a healthy and happy workplace that's driven by a really professional and expert HR department with the right tools and processes and programs in place is the recipe for success. And it's measurable. We're now starting to see that happiness is measurable. Our organizations measure it through our platform, and they're able to react to changes in their team's happiness. They're able to identify challenges, etc. So the talk for me at Cambridge, I've probably got less time than I've just taken to answer your question, but it's really going to be about conveying to the HR people in the room that they are the champions. They're the ones that I look up to. They're the ones that I look to for guidance and for support and for the next innovations that are needed to make sure that people in their organisations are happy and healthy. So that's going to be the premise of the talk. So looking forward to it.
Excellent. Thank you very much. We've just got a couple more minutes here, and I've got 2 more questions for you. And these are questions that we ask of all of our guests. Okay, so I'm going to challenge you to answer each one in 60 seconds or less. The first one is as follows. If you could pass on one crucial lesson that you've learned in your career, Richard, in 1 minute or less, what would be your top tip for HR pros and leaders? Go.
Okay, 1 minute or less. I'll probably do it in 10 seconds. My tip would be listen more than you talk, because that is the gift to getting the right solution for, be it your customers or your people or your business. So yeah, my one top tip to myself when I'm younger would be listen more than you talk.
Excellent. Thank you. And just finally, what is the single biggest change that you think will happen in HR and in leadership over the next 5 to 10 years? And I appreciate that's a huge question, and asking you to answer that in a minute is almost impossible, but give it a go.
Wow, that's going to be a tough one in a minute. And also because, as I mentioned at the very start, I don't have a huge background in HR, but what I do see happening is that I think data-driven decisions around people metrics will form much bigger part of organisation strategy moving forward. So whether it be a retention challenge and keeping hold of your talent, whether it be a happiness challenge and making sure you get as much productivity out of a team as possible, or whether it be an absence challenge or any of those sorts of things. Traditionally, we've been able to measure the outputs, how many people are off sick, how many people are leaving the business, etc., etc. And now we can measure the inputs. How happy are people? What are the biggest challenges they've got? How can we support them moving forward? So that for me is going to be the biggest change. And we're starting to see it now, particularly with progressive organisations. I have the pleasure of working with them, that they get the right measurement tools in place that are effective and instant. And it's data-driven decisions rather than gut feel.
Perfect. Well, that just leaves me to say for today, Richard, thank you very much for being my guest on this episode of the HR in Review pod.
The HR in Review podcast is brought to you by hrreview.co.uk. hrreview.co.uk is a website dedicated to human resources and related professionals. News items are posted daily together with analysis looking in depth at topical HR issues. You can sign up for our range of specialist newsletters at hrreview.co.uk/sign-up and follow us on Twitter at hrreview or join us on LinkedIn and Facebook. Thank you for listening.